Give it a shot.
Okay.
It's always fun.
Interesting, not bad.
Yeah. So it goes.
Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm sure we'll have some folks meandering in. My name is Nicole Trina Flores. I think I know everybody pretty much in the room, minus maybe one. So you all know me, Global Ed Coordinator, but we are lucky to have Dr. Vincent Hathaway and Nikki Eisman here to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and give some history and really break it down for us today. So we're really excited. And then following that, we will go into our award and also our scholarship renaming. So if you have questions, please ask them and we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay, well, as Nicole says, I'm Nikki Eisman and I teach political science, and I've taught political science here at SEC for over 22 years. And I'm very excited. We now have Dr. Hathaway, who comes from multiple institutions on the East Coast, one of which is the University of Maryland, and where he earned his PhD. And he is an expert in Russian, and he speaks Russian. So when he uses the words that refer to where we are in this part of the world, it will be with authentic accent. And he's going to be talking about some of the history of Russia. And I'm going to go ahead and put this slide on. I know this kind of fails our words that we say, but we have a very big screen. So you can read some of these timeline things as he talks about some of our Russian history. Gets us started.
Thank you. Like I said, I'm Griff Hathaway. I have not been here 22 years. I've been here 22 days, I think. So I forget to get the memo that it gets cold here in Nebraska, or at least your definition of cold is different than my definition.
This isn't it.
Yes, this is what I've learned. This is not cold.
This is still balmy.
Yeah. So sunscreen weather for you guys and for me, Arctic. I thought what we'd do is I would give a sort of a brief kind of summation in the history of kind of how we got to this conflict and try to get at some of the reasons why President Putin has in fact chosen to do what he's done in terms of invading Ukraine. And I think what Professor Eisman and I both agree was that if you have questions that pop up in your head, don't feel like you have to stick to this sort of narrative. Ask. Get your hand up and ask the questions, because this isn't really about us here anyways. This is about all of you and you here to find out what information we can have and to answer any questions you've got. So I thought I would begin with a quote that's attributed to Winston Churchill in 1939. Was asked what did he think the Soviet Union, back then Russia was known as the Soviet Union, was going to do on the eve of World War II. And Churchill sort of threw his hands up and he said, well, you know, who can divine the actions of Russia? Russia is a mystery it's a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside of an enigma. But then the part of that quote, he then said, well, but there is a key. The key is Russia's national interest. The trick is figuring out what that is. And so I think the question there would be to look at what Putin's motivations were in terms of launching this invasion. It seems pretty clear that what Putin has is part of a school in Russian historical thought of a mystical view of a greater Russianness, kind of a pan-Slavic collective identity that transcends geography and motivates not just domestic but also foreign policy. To him and to others along that school, everything from language to culture to religion and even ethnicity are all wrapped up in a collectivist notion of a third way of Russia that is sort of the first was Rome, then was Constantinople, and now it's Moscow as kind of the third center of a non-Western, non-Asiatic global path. And I think for Putin, he has bought into this idea of Russia being neither Western nor Asiatic, but unique unto itself. And so what I wanted to try to do, I should also add, and so what that does is it fuels in terms of his foreign policy, it almost necessitates a kind of a revanchist, irredentist foreign policy, one of reconsolidation, of recapture. And what I'll be trying to kind of get there.
Excuse me, what are those words?
Revanchist. Revanchist is just kind of a fancy word. It's French word for like revenge. we lost territory, we lost a war, man, we're gonna get it all back and then some. And irredentist is,
Altering borders without force. And coming after borders with just we're big enough, we're gonna do it, and we're gonna take it without you stopping us.
and all of our, what Nikki said about borders is not all of our people live in these current borders. We will go out and get our people and protect them, even if it means extending our current borders to include those. So in that sense, I think it almost necessitates Russia's foreign policy, being that if you have that view, and it seems pretty clear that Putin has this particular view, and as you could probably ascertain, it's fueled by a sense of grievance. People have said, they say Putin wants to revive the Soviet Union. I mean, that's right. It's true and not true. Putin has no use for the ideology of Bolshevism. I'll get to that in a minute. He has no use for that. But what he does have a use for is recreating a Russocentric or Slavic empire that would reestablish Russia as a concurrent global power. I think what Putin sees is Russia slipping away as the world moves on and the world moves past Russia, and it gets left behind with the global train leaving the station, and Putin is doing his best to do what he can to stop that and to return Russia to, since we've got Thanksgiving coming up, and maybe all of you were like my Thanksgiving as a child, to get back to the grown-ups table. It's sitting at Thanksgiving dinner as opposed to being kicked back to the kids' table, where Russia probably is, aside from its nuclear weapons and its national energy resources, which are substantial. There's not much really there. So the question would be, how did we get there? So very quickly, almost impossible to come up with 1,000 years of history of Russia in about 6 minutes, but I'll do my very best. The origins of Russia were found in what we originally were called Kievan Rus. The word Russia comes from this Prince Rurik. You had a bunch of Slavic tribes right around what modern day would be Kiev, and they found themselves warring and not really able to form a stable peace. So they invited this Nordic prince, a guy named Rurik, to come down and rule over them. And this guy Rurik came from a tribe called the Rus. And so Rurik of the Rus came down, and from Rus we got Russia. And so they became Kievan Rus, the Kiev of the Russians, and then Russia, land of Russians. So the name came from that origin. And an interesting dynamic of, if you're interested in Russian sort of culture, the idea that Russians typically need some sort of external strong power authority figure to bring order and stability. And when that happens, Russia is strong and prosperous. But so Kievan Rus in modern day Kiev is the first origins of the Russian state, and it does pretty well. But it starts to fragment from about 880 AD in the 900s into about the 1000s, and it just sparses out into about 3 different separate Slavic groups, and they became known as in Russian would be the Velika Russia, the Great Russians, the Malika Russia, the Little Russians, and the Biela Russia, the White Russians. And that would translate today, the Great Russians would be what today we would call Russia. Not great in the sense of superior, but great in the sense of a metropolitan area, greater Lincoln area. The greater Russian area is where the modern day Russians were. The Bielo-Russians would be what we call the Ukrainians today. The Little Russians meaning a smaller territory of Slavic Russian speakers. And then the Bielo-Russians, what today we call Belarus, the White Russians, called so because they identified more with Lithuanians and Poles than they did with more of the Asiatic Eastern groups. So they became nicknamed the White Russians. And this is the 3 Slavic tribes that we would see today in modern nation states: Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Then you get the Mongol invasion about 1200, and for about 200 years, what we know today to be Russia is sealed off from the world, and then the Mongols were overthrown. And I'm speeding through all this. At this point, the capital of Kievan Rus has kind of moved eastward to what we today, then it was known as Muscovy, now it's what we call Moscow. And at that point, the Russianness begins to revive, led from Moscow. And at this point, the Muscovite Russians, the Great Russians, take on the additional meaning in English of the word because they see it as their goal to reunite the great glory of Kievan Rus, the first great empire. And it's now up to them to reunite the little Russians, which even today you'll hear some Russian speakers slip into referring to Ukrainians as the little Russians, which goes a long way into speaking as whether they do not accept Ukraine as a sovereign independent state and a separate ethnicity and all that, and the Belarusians. And so the Russian Empire begins to expand mostly westward. You get at the time of Peter the Great, a real schism begins to develop in Russian culture. If you know, oh yeah, go ahead.
What's a schism?
A split, not so much a divorce, but a real divide as to who we are as a people. And this divide was between the Peter the Great types who were called Westernizers, and they saw Russia's future as with the West following the leads of, back then the powers would be England and France, versus what we call the Slavophiles, those who believed that Russia had a unique Slavic identity that was neither Asiatic and certainly not European. And so this schism always was below the surface. As the Russian Empire expanded, mostly westward, the divide didn't break out too often because both sides were satisfied, both the Westernizers and the Slavophiles were satisfied with the expansion of empire. For the Westernizers, they thought they were following what great European countries do. This is, of course, 1700s, 1800s, into the 1900s. Great European countries have empires, the French Empire, the British Empire, even the Prussian Germans had some empire. This is what European countries do. So as far as Russia was building empire, that didn't bother the Slavophiles much, because for the Slavophiles, they were expanding a Slavic-led empire that they eventually hoped would take over as a sort of third wave, a Rome, Constantinople, Moscow. So the interests were mutual, neither is not exclusive, but were coincident. And then when you get the Soviet era, one other thing, the empires also, they provided, I should say, two other things. On the one hand, it gave Russia a sense of a buffer, that is to say, a protection from Western invasions. That was fine with the Westernizers, as you've had Napoleon and then Germany twice in the 20th century invading. At the same time, the Slavophiles liked it because they saw it as insulation, insulating from Western non-Slavic ideologies and identities. So again, the mutual purposes were served. When the Soviet era and Bolshevism came, the Slavophiles were not particularly thrilled about that, but they could tolerate it because as far as they saw it, even if Bolshevism gave the Soviet Union an ideological imprimatur or excuse, let's say, they were fine with that because it was still in its essence a Russian empire, just under ideological or semi-ideological guidance. But the Slavophiles never really took to that because one, Bolshevism is a Western ideology, or Marxism comes from Germany, actually. So, and secondly, Marxism is something that tamps down or tends to oppose nationalist sentiments. There's no such thing as national identities, which would go completely against a Slavophile, Russophile identity. So the Slavophiles were never real thrilled with Bolshevism, but they could tolerate it. When the Soviet Union broke apart, though, they weren't particularly upset by that, at least insofar as the loss of Bolshevism, but what they were particularly upset about was the loss of empire. Now, I think I have to wrap up very quickly. When the Soviet Union actually imploded, it was the three Slavic countries, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, that drove the final stake in 1991 by setting their own, you probably remember this as the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS, as an alternative or replacement to the Soviet Union that at that point dissolved. So the idea was to recreate some sort of union that would be Slavic-led. But there was, even if there were two or three independent Slavic countries, for this pan-Slavic notion, it never really occurred to them that Ukraine was a really seriously sovereign country. I mean, okay, technically it was, but it wasn't really to be taken seriously. And so for the first part, let's say the first decade of the breakup of the Soviet Union, there wasn't a lot of tensions between Russia and Ukraine. Also, you had different leaders. You had Boris Yeltsin and you had Leonid Kravchuk, former Soviet leaders, who were busy trying to navigate the first decade of sovereignty. But when Putin comes in on Christmas or New Year's Eve 1999, and you get a change in the Ukrainian leadership from Kravchuk to this guy Kuchma, then Russia begins to take a greater interest in what the leadership of Ukraine is going to be. And just to wrap up quickly, things come to a head in 2013, 2014. And I can answer questions about what goes on in between that, but I want to get to Professor Eisman's presentation. In 2013, 2014, the Ukrainian leadership is prepared to sign an association treaty with the European Union. It's not membership to the EU, but it's the stepping stone or the path onto that. At the same time, Vladimir Putin is offering what he calls the Eurasian Economic Union, or the Eurasia Economic Union, which would be, of course, the Russian Slavic alternative to the European Union. And even though the leader of Ukraine at the time, Yanukovych, is inclined to be pro-Russian, he thinks he's going to sign the treaty with the European Union. Putin puts enormous pressure on Yanukovych and the Ukrainian leadership to not sign the European Union Agreement Treaty. Ukraine says, okay, we're not going to sign it. We're going to join with the Eurasian group. Enormous protests break out. If you ever heard the term the Maidan is the famous square in downtown Kyiv, where all these protests break out against the decision to go with the Eurasian Union and not the European Union. Protesters are shot. There's a violent crackdown. The pro-Russian leader, president, is forced to flee. There are new elections, and that brings in a staunchly pro-Ukrainian government that then completely rejects the the Eurasian group and decides that Ukraine's future is going to be with the European Union. The new president is a guy named Poroshenko. Poroshenko is succeeded by Zelensky, the current Ukrainian president. And at this point, what you've got, and those guys realize, both Poroshenko and Zelensky realize that they probably need to adopt a greater Ukrainianization of Ukraine, which in effect is kind of a de-emphasis of Russian influences, and that's within Ukraine. That's absolutely the way Putin sees it. And so when Yanukovych is forced to flee, that is when in 2014 Russia decides, well, we're going to invade Crimea. We're going to seize Crimea, which historically, at that time was part of Ukraine, and then precipitates a pro-Russian revolt in the areas you're probably familiar with, the Donbass area, Luhansk and Donetsk, are these eastern republics of Ukraine that border on Russia, the sort of western part of Russia. And the Russians eventually send troops. So the first time Russia invades Ukraine is in 2014 to prop up these pro-Russian separatist groups. And things sort of settle there from 2014 up to 2019, 2020. And the current, as I'll wrap up here to Professor Eisman, the current crisis is kind of precipitated by Putin thinking now is the time. I went into Crimea and I went into the Donbass, and the West didn't really do a whole lot. Here it is in 2020. America is divided politically, very polarized. European Union is convulsing. Brexit is still ongoing, but Britain is leaving the European Union. We don't know what the European Union is going to be. One of the anchors in the European Union, Angela Merkel, the former leader of Germany, is leaving. In her place comes Viktor Orban, sort of nationalist, populist leader of Hungary. And the European Union appears to be slightly rudderless. And Putin figures now is a terrific time for me to go into Ukraine, something that I will flat out confess I got completely wrong until the day that invasion happened. I just did not think he would actually do it. I still am blown away that Russia invaded Ukraine, but that's the point where we are now, where things aren't. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, but where things stand now is a perfectly good segue to turn over to the far more imminent partner of this collective here, and that is Professor Eisman. She can take it from here.
So he Dr. Griffith talked a lot about, Dr. Hathaway talked a lot about the language and culture and Slavic identity that the Russian people have, but also I wanted to point to this Indo-linguistic map. One of the things that happened under the Soviet Union is all the republics that were pulled together into the Soviet Union, their languages, their culture, their religious practices were all so oppressed the entire time. That's the role of communism: oppress religion, oppress everything identity specific. So that meant that when the former Soviet Union then broke apart, all those separate ethnic ties came forward, and the Ukrainians especially wanted to still, bring back their religion. Although the children who'd grown up through that period of time, in our time, the 90s, and in through the early 2000s, were learning Ukrainian for the first time. So people who are fighting this war today primarily have only learned Ukrainian. Their parents all still know Russian. And the language of high culture in Ukraine is Russian. The language of, cinema, of everything is still Russian. In the major cities across Ukraine, it's still Russian. The movies and things that come over from, that come into their country from the former Soviet Union are all in Russian. So they have this blend of language, and their identity is still Ukrainian, but the language they're still dealing with is Russian, which made it a lot easier to kind of bring into the minds of the people and the identity that the people have. The young people, though, are really trying to push this Ukrainian nationalism. And so that's why it's been kind of this battle for hearts and minds that we've been watching play out for the last, how many years, or last 17, 20 years through Iraq and Afghanistan. We've been watching the same thing happen. So we see this going on in Ukraine itself. Then flash forward to the next bit. Can you advance to our next slide, please? Thank you. I appreciate that, Nicole. Our device isn't working for me here. So in 2012, we have this event of the Winter Games in Sochi. So Sochi is in Russia, and it's over here on this particular little side. Here's Crimea, and then obviously right up here you see the bit that is Ukraine. So you're gonna, oh, you went too far. Go back to the one that says Sochi Olympics. It's between there. What? How do you not have it? Go back up. You should have the version that it can't be not there. It's keep going down. See if you have it. Keep scrolling down. I don't know where we go. Keep going. Keep going. How do you not have Sochi Olympics on there? That is the only version of this you have. Okay. Well, that just makes no sense to me. I don't know why. It's always been involved. This isn't going to work. I have no idea because it was always in the presentation. Okay, go back up to the one that has the linguistic in. Okay, so yes. Let's see, this will work. Here we go. Here's Crimea. Right over here is Sochi. This is the bit that is Sochi. This is Russia. This whole order here, and right here is Sochi Olympics. So the Olympics are here, and when they happen in 2012, our buddy, Vladimir Putin says, hey, we're going to need more military to secure the games for the Olympics. So our better plan would be to bring a lot of military down, so all the athletes who are coming in for the Winter Games feel very secure. We'll make sure everybody's taken care of. And then the Sochi Olympics go off without much of a, tourism scandal that everybody's worried about in 2012, and all the Olympic athletes go home and the military stays. And the military is sitting there, and the European Union is like, why aren't you guys going home? Nobody's back. There's no worry about the game, Olympic Games now. He's like, yeah, we're just going to run some little exercises over here. It's still winter. We thought we'd take advantage of all the military being in that location. And the European Union is still getting nervous and saying, yeah, but everybody go back home. We don't need you guys right there. That's making us nervous. And they said, don't worry about us. Mind your own business. Next thing you know, they're in Crimea. So the military plan all along from Putin, and all the world watchers were like, we don't like them staying there. But too late, they're there. So that makes everybody nervous. Now you can advance to the next slide. So he talked about the Eurasia effort that Putin was trying to advance. We have some other organizations that work in the international community, and one of those is this group called the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This is 37 countries who are market-based partners, which not Russia. Russia is more communist-based and state-controlled media, state-controlled economics, and it has been the entire time. Even though we went from what seemed like the fall of communism, it still maintained its kind of one-party state-controlled economic structure. And they went to completely unregulated capitalism, which is the opposite of what we have in the United States. It may seem like in the United States we have capitalism, but what we have is heavily regulated capitalism. And you may hear people talking about socialism versus capitalism versus market capitalism. We have market capitalism where anybody can come up with an idea, make a product and sell it, but it is very regulated. You know, we have regulated utilities, we have regulated safety concerns. If you try to build a house anywhere, you got to make sure you have infrastructure in place. You have to have the, you know, the pipelines in place, electricity in place, everything in place before you even start to build a house. So all those things make ours regulated. That is not what they did in Russia. Instead, when the fall came in Russia, they went to anybody can build anything, anywhere, anytime. So you have an apartment building over here, and you have a hotel over here. And then when the hotel went up and all those Russian oligarchs that you hear about started making tons of money, they just said, oh, all that, you know, the pipelines and the electricity and the water and everything I need for this hotel. Yeah, we're just going to take it from this apartment building. You guys are going to have no water. You're going to have no electricity. We'll just put it in this hotel, and the oligarchs became rich. They had no regulation. So these guys over here living in the apartment building are like, what the heck? So they became very upset. And then these guys over here became very wealthy in the apartment hotel that's on this side. So now they said, what are we going to do about, you know, doing something about these citizens over here? And these guys said, yeah, we want that communism back. That made sure we had the basic services at least. Yeah, true, we didn't have 47 kinds of toothpaste, but at least we had one. So they'd rather have more control. So they decided to support Putin and everything he was doing. They wrote a constitution in 1991 that looked very much like a democratic constitution. But in the end, they said, oh yeah, about that thing where, you know, Putin and or the president they were electing at the time, Medvedev, when you have one the prime minister, one the president, they kept swapping places. They weren't supposed to keep doing that. But then when Putin exerted more control and started putting regulations, or at least rules on the guys that were the Russian oligarchs that were making all that money immediately, then they said, yeah, we don't mind. We don't mind that he's bringing back some of that control. So everybody at least gets basic services. So that was a very popular idea for a while. In Europe, what do we have? We have, this is, could you advance it to the next thing? So I can, there we go. At least this slide's here as intended. We have some very basic alignments that people are used to. We talk about NATO, which is the countries that you're going to see here in the red. I'm going to have another slide in a minute, which better be present, that shows you what the NATO forces are. Then we have what we call the great powers. You see these guys right here in the orange. These are technically the first 5 that you see: Britain, Germany, France, Russia, and China also have something in common. Does anybody know what those 5 have in common? Not
They
Japan.
all have large empires.
They all have large empires. They are the largest in mass, largest in gross national product. They are the 5 permanent members of UN Security Council. Technically, people refer to them as the victors of World War II. I'm going to argue with some of those, but that's what they're called. And they are the founding members of then part of the UN Security Council. And they also, obviously, because they control the wealth and or the size of territory on the planet, they get to make a lot of decisions in the UN Security Council, which means they vote when they don't want things to happen. So when we say, hey, we'd like to have sanctions against Russia for their activities in Ukraine, it's the Security Council that votes for that. And guess who's not going to vote for that right now? Russia and technically China. They're not going to vote against the things that are going on. So when you're hearing about all the atrocities happening in Ukraine, Russia and China aren't going to say those are atrocities happening in Ukraine. So this group here is what's telling us, and why we're not hearing Ukraine, hearing the UN castigate what's happening. The General Assembly got together. That's where all 193 members of the United Nations and or organized countries that are recognized by the United Nations. There are some groups like Kurdistan or Palestine that are not recognized states in the United Nations. The General Assembly got together, and most of the nations that are present said, we do not agree with what's happening in Ukraine, but not the Security Council, because this is the main membership. So they're not going to say it. And then we call these other ones in green you see here down on the bottom, or teal, they are what we call middle powers. And these countries are, obviously not in favor of that. And they would rather see some changes here. Oh, sorry. Germany is, this is in this list here. Germany is not in the one of the 5 members of the Security Council. That's actually the United States in this position. Sorry. Okay, next we're going to look at this one, NATO. Okay, so NATO was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded in 1949. And in this particular group, we see, obviously, the purpose of NATO was to stop the advance of Soviet Union into Western Europe. Well, that worked out. At the time, we did not see the Soviet Union advancing into Western Europe. But now, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we have concerns. The first time they have ever used any force was in Bosnia in 1994. That's a pretty long time for NATO to ever need any actual, organization of their military. The NATO forces are different than the European military forces. The European Union doesn't have an army. because they relied on NATO this entire time. You've heard previous presidents of ours say we should probably end NATO and get out of it. And some have said, okay, well, that's an idea, but actually having NATO means, if you look at the countries who are part of NATO, I'm gonna go back to this real quick in a second. Can you advance one more slide, please, real quick? Here are the countries that are part of NATO. You see this entire group here. This is the country that is Ukraine. They're not, but they have been invited in. And actually, it was that invitation for Ukraine to join into NATO that really made Putin mad. So you've heard about what happened when we had the election of a pro-European president in Ukraine, which we forgot to mention how poisoned he got. He was the guy that got poisoned with the pockmarks all over his face. You might have seen those images in the news when that happened. Yeah, Russia was really upset with him. And Russia, I'm not naming names, but it's Putin, poisons people who are his enemies when they're outside of the world. And they're British, if they're British in England as journalists, or if they're anywhere else in the world, you'll see them get this, what's usually dioxin poisoning, pockmarks their whole faces, and you get these big bubbles and boils. Sometimes they die, sometimes they survive in the case of the Ukrainian president. But that was a pretty bad scene there. And that was just getting elected to be pro-European. This time, they actually almost included Ukraine in NATO, and NATO was for it. And in fact, Russia had been attending NATO meetings all through our conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. But when we extended an invitation, we as NATO extended the invitation to join, went one too far for Putin. And that's what really said, listen, as Griff pointed out, you didn't say that we couldn't join, you couldn't come in, and we couldn't invite you over to join us in NATO forces. But when that crossed the line, you left us in Crimea alone. And as Griff pointed out already, Brexit had occurred. The US government is in, real dichotomy at this point. And he thought, this is the time, you're the most vulnerable, I think I'll jump in. So if we look, there is this thing in the NATO treaty called the Article 5. And it says if one country is attacked, all of us are attacked and we will all defend. The European Union, as I said, doesn't have an army, so it has to be NATO that comes to its defense. Well, of course, while we're working and talking about this presentation yesterday, thank you, Twitter, for updating me live all the time. Yesterday, there were missiles that were found and reported to have gone into Poland, but it turns out they were Russian missiles, but they came from Ukraine, and it turns out they were shot apparently by Ukraine upon further investigation. Now, it is in Ukraine's interest to have NATO get in, and Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has been asking for this the whole time. And I appreciate his point of view, but we are not ready as NATO to take on we've been busy for the last 20 years in another war. We don't have the resources, the military capacity probably at this point, nor the will of the American people and other NATO countries to engage in a war with Russia. So at this point, I don't feel like that's going to be the direction we go. So on further investigation, they looked and said, okay, we have seen the Ukrainian army come up with caches of Russian weapons. They are now using those Russian weapons to shoot at the Russians. So when this inadvertently went into Poland, which is a NATO country, they were trying to say, and others were trying to say, oh no, the Polish have been hit by the Russians, which would invoke Article 5. But actually, it turns out it was really Ukrainians shooting Russian artillery. Not the same thing at all. But we do know, and we've been warned, can you advance? Thank you for keeping up with what I'm doing. We know that the Ukrainians, and this was something that was advised by our then Moscovian ambassador from the United States, William Burns. He said, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin, but all the Russian elite. And this is the thing that was invited this summer. They said, Ukraine, join us. And when that happened before the summer before February 22 is when this happened. So it was in summer 21 when the invitation was extended. And then by February, Putin's like, yeah, we're not having that. William Burns is now Biden's CIA director. And one of the things I really appreciate about our elected officials is when they keep over the experts from one presidential administration to the other. We call that continuity of government. And I appreciate that. So we are seeing William Burns serving as our CIA director. So luckily we have his Russian expertise involved in Biden's administration as well. And we're looking for that. So I know we're trying to run out of time. We want to get us past it. Okay, I'm going to show you this real quickly. Here's where the Russian troops are still acting. This is what's going on now. This was just, the 14th, obviously. So they have been pushed back, which is a good thing. And I think one of the questions that you're probably want to know about is this one. Can you always skip the people? We know who they are. I have the people if you want to see who they are, but what are the chances of us getting into nuclear war? This is a question you guys probably want to ask us, or probably want to know. We have already active in Ukraine right now, the Atomic Energy Agency, which is an arm of the United Nations. You've heard of them before. They've been highlighted in this movie called Team America with Kim Jong-un. Might have seen him in cartoon. Nobody knows that movie? Just
I
me?
know that.
Thank you. Well, good. Others of you, it's a stop action animation movie, but it does highlight how the IAEA works. What, the Shark Tank wasn't? No, it's a good part. But the IAEA does look at where nuclear technology or nuclear bases are located or nuclear plants are located. It's an arm of the UN, so it's an international group, and it is in there watching the active nuclear plants in Ukraine, making sure Russians aren't going there collecting any nuclear material for the purpose of making dirty bombs. Russia has all the nuclear weapons they need if they really want to launch anything, but also the United States does. And what has worked allegedly and apparently and so far is something called mutually assured destruction, which is the idea if they aim at, well, in this case, Ukraine or us, we have the ability to fire back. And that's a terrible way to be, but it is what has worked. It's one of the reasons why the current country, Iran, wants to develop nuclear weapons. They believe they're the only one on the block without nuclear devices. So they want to develop nuclear technology. It's one of the reasons why we've tried to keep them at bay in developing those nuclear weapons. And the reality is we, the United States, are the only country that's ever used atomic weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we've been paying for it ever since. We are a protectorate of Japan, and we have paid them ever since for that degradation. So that's it. And we have to argue, unless you are a country who can pay for the country you destroy and disseminate and decimate with those devices, then you shouldn't have them. And that's why countries like Russia and, Iran shouldn't have them. And or anyone else. Okay, do you guys have any questions you want to ask us? It's just a little light conversation on a Wednesday morning. Nuclear war, that's it.
It's always a big hit when you bring, supposing when you bring in Team America World Police from the creators of South Park, if you're familiar.
That's what. Gotta have a little levity when you're talking about nuclear war.
All the quotes.
Putin won't accept defeat, right? His ego is too.
What's his extract? What's his extract? We've talked about it amongst ourselves. We know we have an idea of how he can save face here. And the idea is he keeps Crimea, but the Ukrainians don't want that. And why is Crimea so important? It's his cold water port. Let's go back up to, do you have one of these? The map that has I guess we're gonna go back to this one. So the brown, the one with the linguistic map, the brown territory here. Okay, so this is Crimea. This is our, technically our Black Sea. And this is where the naval submarines and naval fleet come out of Russia. It is a warm water port. Everywhere else there's ocean for Russia is cold and sometimes locked in ice. So Putin needs that warm water port. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine said, you're going to pay us for access. And he didn't like that because when it was the Soviet Union, he didn't have to pay anybody. But now he has to pay to use it. And Ukraine was raising the price for renting access to the warm water ports. And he's like, well, I'll fix that. I'll just own it. So when he took Crimea, then he didn't have to pay to use the port because it's the warm water access he needs for all his subs and all the, domination of the world he thinks he needs. So that is the whole reason they want Crimea. They want that warm water port access. And that's his extract is to be able to maintain Crimea and have the rest of the world community acknowledge that Crimea is his, always was his, and should remain his. So that's the only way really I think he can extract and save face. We'll see. But also he wants the part that's in the yellow and brown stripes, which Ukraine doesn't want to give up.
Where does the US stand on that?
There's different parts of the US, Mary Jan. Which one do you want to know about? So
The current
the current administration wants no involvement in any of it. And they want to maintain our role in NATO. And actually, we don't have any country in Europe that has a strong leadership role currently. And the United States started under Obama administration, continued under Trump because Trump didn't want to be part of NATO, and is continuing under Biden. And that is to say Europe should lead NATO. And there isn't a strong leader. You mentioned the word rudderless, but between Angela Merkel, who was the strong leader in Europe, She has now stepped out. There's this current guy at the moment named Otto Schultz. He doesn't know what the hell he's doing. We know Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister of England, who was there for 44 days. She's not a strong Prime Minister in Great Britain. The new guy, he's very new in leadership and politics in the British level, in the Prime Ministership there. He doesn't know what he's doing. It's all neophytes in serving in Europe at the moment. So
Not even Macron.
no,
Okay.
unfortunately, he does not have foreign experience. He's floundering in country as well. He's got his own economic crisis. The world, as you might have noticed, is a bit of an inflation economic, problem. And that's because of the pandemic. So dealing with international affairs right now, nobody wants to do it. And the reality is we have an international crisis. And one of the reasons why, there have been presidents in the past who say they don't want to deal with international affairs. Obama specifically is one of them. And so is Trump. The problem is international affairs deals with you. So you've got to notice this is going on. And one of the problems that happened when President Obama was first elected is that he said, I'm going to ignore that President Bush said he was going to put nuclear missiles into the country of Georgia, which is also a former republic. He said, I'm just going to ignore that. And Putin's like, I'm going to need an answer. And he said, no, we're not going to deal with international relations right now. We'll just let that plan rest. And Putin kept saying, but I'm going to need an answer. And Obama said, but I'm not doing that. He said that was a different administration. And Putin kept saying, but I'm going to need an answer. And so he didn't. And then Putin sent nuclear submarines to 12 miles off the US eastern seaboard, rolling up and down, like literally knocking on the door and saying, I'm gonna need an answer. But Obama believed he could ignore it and not make an answer or not give an answer, and then that would be fine. And Putin reminded him, that's not how international affairs works, and I'm going to need you to respond. So then Obama said, okay, let me look at those plans again. Yeah, we're not doing it. How's that? No, we're not putting a nuclear base in Georgia. And then that was the answer. But guess what Obama did do? He said, we're just going to keep them rolling on trains because the missiles were already in Georgia. The US missiles were already rolling in Georgia, and they're still rolling in Georgia. And they're going to stay there now because he's got stuff happening in Ukraine. So that makes me nervous. That's like movie plot 46, nuclear missiles rolling on trains in the country of Georgia. I'd rather than be in a fixed military base. But nobody asked us what we would do. Nobody from the government asked us. So that's currently where the situation lies. And presidents who don't win, or world leaders who don't want to acknowledge when international affairs happens, what should be our plan, it's an issue. Which then means, remember I mentioned that continuity of government thing? It means they rely on the people who've been in service longer, and that's the military. And that is not ideal in a democracy where you have a civilian commander-in-chief. Which is why when you vote, you should pay attention to what they want their plan to be for international relations and international policy. What does the commander-in-chief want, the civilian commander-in-chief? Because when they are newly elected and they don't have a plan for international affairs, they will defer to the military. May not be your idea. Any other questions?
Going back to Phip's question,
Yes.
is there any exit? I mean, it's hard to envision an exit strategy for Putin because he
Well,
has an enormous ego.
right.
He had the Crimea and he wasn't content. So the idea that he'd be satisfied to just go back to
Right.
having the Crimea.
He did have the Crimea, but that is and the yellow-brown stripe area that he wants as well. Zelensky wants nothing less than everything, everything, including Crimea. But there have been there are groups, including the G7 meeting right now in Indonesia, that is trying to get everybody on some page that will broker a peace agreement. But yeah, they haven't come to a decision yet, and so that's why. Because Europe allowed him in 2012, 2014 to keep Crimea, and there is the wisdom in Europe to say, yeah, you should probably let that go, Zelensky, and they're trying to convince him to do that. So now we're dealing with the personalities of two leaders, and when it comes down to it, a lot of politics becomes, how you deal with the individual psychology.
Well, I feel like the West let him have it. I mean,
That is what happened.
so.
That is what happened.
Yeah.
Mhm. And as he pointed out before, that was Little Russia. I mean, that is how the Slavic empires began. And so in Putin's historical point of view, that was always Russian. The whole territory was always Russian. And go ahead.
I would say that the exit strategy is what it will be based upon what each side is willing to settle for. And at the end of any diplomatic negotiation, what you end up settling for is what you never thought you'd agree to when you started.
Right.
So it seems to me there's a multiple actors and it's all a big Venn diagram. And what Putin would settle for is staying in power. That to me would be his bottom line. This war is an existential crisis for Putin's reign. It's not an existential crisis for Russia. For Zelensky and the Ukrainians, what will they settle for? That will probably be imposed upon them. I think they will have to be forced.
By Western Europe, because let's go forward. What happens if Putin tries to push nuclear use? He's removed, we think, by his own generals.
It's hard for me to see.
Right.
How, I mean, we wouldn't be talking about global thermonuclear war. We're talking about tactical
Neighborhood.
battlefield
Neighborhood.
use of any sort of weapons, and Ukrainians don't have that capability. So it would be, what scenario would it be in which Russia would feel the need to detonate a tactical nuclear device against a non-nuclear foe, in which case the existential nature of Russia is not at risk. Russia is not going to disappear. So why would you go to the ultimate weapon? It's hard for me to see Putin, for all of Putin's rattling, and you do take it seriously because he has the capacity. You can't ignore it. But there's no evidence that Russians are doing anything to accelerate their nuclear readiness. But in America, we call it DEFCON. There's no side. Putin makes some comment about we've gone to double secret nuclear, whatever the heck he said. There's no evidence of that. I stress that because if you're threatening, if you're rattling your nuclear saber, you don't do it secretly. I mean, a rattlesnake doesn't shake its rattle quietly. It doesn't want to bite you. If Putin is really serious about escalating to nuclear weapons, he's going to show the evidence that Russia is moving closer to such a thing, and he hasn't. So I don't know that what the comment is for, or comments are for, except for maybe more of the domestic purpose. That all said, to get your point, what the exit strategy will be something to. I don't know how this war ends with Putin in power. Let me stress the first part of that. The war might not end.
Well,
There are frozen conflicts. The most obvious would be on the Korean Peninsula. There are frozen conflicts in Georgia. The CIS Georgia with South
Cyprus.
Abkhazia and Ossetia.
you know, obviously Putin was heavily involved in, the bombing in Syria that just went on and on
Yes,
and on,
yes,
and
yes,
nobody
yes.
wants to stop.
Right.
And he sees that as an example.
That's right.
What's to stop him? I mean, he can't sustain a land war, but he could sustain
Well,
air bombing for.
but internally, his own propaganda hasn't been working as well as he wants to keep signing up his own population.
Mhm.
And he's trying to bring more soldiers, his own population, his own soldiers in. But the difference is he used to control the media in World War II era. Today, he can't control the media as well. So they're able to see what's happening outside the country in media and know that isn't true, that the war isn't going their way. That's the
But
difference.
he has a large quantity of bombs. I mean,
Yes, he
do
can. He wants to use
aerosols
the
on
bombs. Yeah,
Ukraine
he
for
does.
I
the
suspect that.
foreseeable future.
Yeah.
I suspect that will happen. No Russian soldiers go home to their families in boxes when you can fire cruise
Right.
missiles at Ukrainian
Right.
water supplies, electrical supplies,
Which he did this week.
which will cost the Western European rebuild efforts more money. The time arguably is on Russia's side, depending on what Putin is willing to rein back. And it seems he isn't going to conquer Kyiv. He isn't going to reacquire Ukraine. So what is he willing to settle for? If he wants to stay in power, probably a prolonged conflict in which he keeps lobbing missiles. He heats the war up every now and again. He reminds the West what he can do. The West gets fatigued. The West gets tired. The West has elections. Things change, and puts in place for time. I don't know that he has a clear exit strategy. I think you would ask. I don't think he ever envisioned he'd be in this position right now on November 15th. I thought he truly believed he would waltz in there and he'd be greeted with flowers and candies and chocolates and all that, and nothing has gone right. He's miscalculated everything at this point. So that to me, I think is where, oh, yeah,
Does, I don't want to get outside your realm of expertise, if you feel comfortable.
that's why she's here.
There does seem to be a soft spot in American politics for Putin and Russia, a permissiveness. Is that a reality, do you think? That there
No,
is
I don't think there is.
I could name a political party.
No.
I would-
You don't see
No.
that, you don't
No.
see that.
The
There's a relationship, something, if there's money or whatever it is, I don't know.
To answer your question,
No.
the first thing I would look at is what is the size of what appears to be the Republican majority going to be in the House of Representatives? And it looks like that's going to be the case. Now we get it right. Well, if the speaker to be, probably Kevin McCarthy, has a 25 seat majority, then he probably has enough votes to spare from what would be a sort of neo-isolationist wing of both the far right of the Republican Party and the far left of the Republican Party.
Right.
If you've been following this, you saw that the Progressive Party, or the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, they'd written a letter. They actually wrote it back in June. For reasons that escaped me, it was released just last week, urging President Biden to seek some negotiation. And there was enough with Russia and peace. There was a lot of pushback on that. They withdrew the letter. So on both extreme wings of the parties, there
No,
are some neo-isolationist elements. I think it would have to depend upon the House majority to be. We don't know that yet. But of course, the House and the Senate have to agree on all funding and in any upcoming funding bills, including foreign aid to Ukraine and increasing military assistance to Ukraine and others, that would have to pass Congress. And right now, I don't know what the votes or the shakeout's going to be. The Democrats will probably have the Senate, but the Republicans will have the House. We just don't know how many votes. If McCarthy has 20 votes to spare, that's one thing. If he's got a 4-seat majority, it's a different ballgame.
there was a period of time when remember when I mentioned that Putin had come into and was attending meetings in, with the NATO and was talking about support for Iraq, Afghanistan, all that kind of stuff. And when that was going on, President Bush did have, feel that he could see into the soul of Putin. And he made that comment at some point, but that was then, and this is now, the very different period of time. So no, Putin has revealed himself to be, somewhat of a different beast. So there is no love in either, I think, party.
What sort of deterrence do you think NATO should do with the Ukrainian missile strikes on Poland?
Well, because it's been proven that the Ukrainian missile strikes were actually Russian military equipment used in Poland, I think NATO's going to stand down and now be mindful that anything coming from Ukraine could be Russian military equipment because they've recovered caches of weapons.
I think it's a pretty clear warning to all sides that nobody wants this to spiral out of control.
No.
This was a flare.
Yep.
And nobody wants this to get out of hand to a point of no return.
But it has activated international investigators. So they are in Poland, they're in Poland and they're going to be more watchful. So that is to both sides, they'll be watching.
Keep an eye on the sabotage, Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline.
Oh, yeah.
Mysterious explosion that fuels Germany as we head into the winter.
Oh.
We have the drones that are flying around Denmark and Finland.
In Finland.
Don't know where they're coming from. Sabotage activities in NATO countries where you can't prove that it's the Russians. But
People think it is up in,
that provokes war
Finland,
scares, nuclear
Norway.
scares.
Yep.
I wish we had a crystal ball, a Ouija board or something that I could tell you how this is all going to end. And I don't know. I really don't know how something has been set in motion by Putin's invasion, and where it ends up, I don't know. But it's been set in motion. And maybe
Mhm.
beyond what people can control.
Any questions?
Thank you.
We do have two other quick things to do. We
Kids, there's the slides. Everybody sees those. Right? Makes no sense.
So we wanted to give our award today as well as talk about our renaming of our scholarship. So our award is the Global Education Award, and it's designed to give our global education team an opportunity to recognize faculty and staff who promote, foster, encourage global education at SCC through various avenues. Includes education, teaching, project activity development, engagement, participation in global ed and diversity activities on campus or in the community. The purpose of the award is to recognize the staff member or faculty who contributes and has a commitment to continuing cultural differences between people from diverse backgrounds, excuse me. In this person's nomination, the nominator included such comments as, "What I notice even more is this person's passion to connect people from diverse backgrounds here at the college. Outside of the institution, they encourage others to partake in the diversity available here in Lincoln, and I know that my experience at SCC has been much more rewarding because of them." Please join me in celebrating Kara Benedict, Co-Chair of Humanities. Did I surprise you?
Yeah.
Perfect. All the
Very
better.
much.
So stand up there so I can take your picture. I'm just trying to get away from me here.
Thank you.
Mary Jan Fiala, member of our global ed team. Can you talk about our meeting?
Yes, we have just one more important announcement that we want to share with you. We have been incredibly fortunate out of immense loss that a glimmer of light is showing through. In August of 2022, with the passing of Dr. Jim Eisman, our college community took a major hit. Jim was a dedicated and steadfast, hardworking presence here on the SCC campus, serving as a history instructor since 1999. He and his family, including wife and fellow instructor Nikki Eisman, elected to dedicate a portion of his memorials to the Global Education Student Travel Scholarship. Because of their generosity, we were able to endow the scholarship, allowing it to live on long after all of us are gone. It is with immense gratitude that we have decided to honor Jim for generations to come by renaming our scholarship in his name, the Dr. Jim Eisman Global Education Scholarship. Thank you to you, Nikki, and your family, as well as everyone else who has donated. We are grateful for the contributions, and we appreciate you joining us for this session today.
Thank you. Please make sure to fill out does it work?
This QR
Our
code is
QR code
is the bus.
Hopefully we
It's
can
not really.
email.
So we're gonna have to recommunicate.
Okay.
The one that is attached to the email is correct.
Okay. Thank you so much, and we hope you'll join us tomorrow for our discussion on mental health and engagement.
Then we reach out to the students that are here.